첫 번째 강연 소개해드릴 차례입니다. 이번에 소개해드릴 연사는 미치 파오니 연사인데요. 미치 파오니님은 디아 스튜디오 공동대표 맡고 있습니다. 디아 스튜디오는 스위스 제네바와 뉴욕에 거점을 두고 있고요. 브랜딩 또 디자인 스튜디오, 특히 타이포그래픽과 모션 그래픽 등에서 세계 정상급 실력을 인정받고 있는 스튜디오입니다. 독창적인 아이디어를 바탕으로 페이스북, 나이키, 발렌시아가 같은 세계적인 기업과도 협력을 하고 있는데요. 자, 지금부터 미치 파오니 연사의 Tools Not Rules, 규칙이 아닌 수단일 뿐이라는 주제의 강연 함께 하시겠습니다.
Hi there. My name is Mitch Paone. I'm the partner and creative director of Dia Studio, located here in Geneva, Switzerland, and also the rest of the team is in New York. I am also a lecturer at the Geneva School of Art and Design and a visiting lecturer at the Royal Academy of Art in The Hague in the Netherlands. But interesting, actually, before I get into the presentation, I want to say a special thanks to Create Herald Design Forum. It's a huge honor to be invited to give a lecture at your event. Unfortunately, it's remotely given, but I would have loved to visit there in person. So hopefully sometime in the future, I'll be able to do that. But kind of want to talk about an interesting subject today. I have a lot of thoughts and maybe critiques on the way branding and design systems are created in a sort of contemporary context. So the title of this presentation is called Tools, Not Rules. Really want to consider how we can empower and develop systems in a way that can evolve and to the future in the context of the way the work lives now and not be sort of trapped into existing habits of the past. So let me just get into this. Just a little bit about us. Dia Studio, if you're not familiar, we're a branding and design firm. Like I said, working between Geneva and New York. We work on a wide range of projects, whether it's visual identities for commercial or cultural institutions, whether it's commercials, TV commercials, and then even experiential projects. So our work kind of covers a large gamut, spectrum of sort of the design studio would. So we're not traditionally just doing branded, not doing just books, not just doing websites. It's pretty much everything. But I think something that's pretty specific to our studio is the thinking about generative design and motion being very central to the design process itself. They aren't just sort of add-ons to the process later. They become very much the point of creation of how we work. So which really leads into some bigger questions that I want to answer today within this presentation. But yeah, it's just some examples of some of the projects we've done over the years. But anyway, I'm just going to kind of move forward. So I think we've all kind of seen these diagrams of logos, and this kind of brings me to a broader question of like, why are we doing this? What's the point of all of this? To me, it's a bit of nonsense, little post-rationalization of, maybe design and security, or maybe nostalgia to a modernist period of time. But, ultimately, these elements or these grids or this construction serves as some sort of justification for what we're trying to do. But in the context of today's work, I find this to be somewhat ridiculous, and I'm not being critical of these projects by all means. I think these are actually really, really fine examples of branding projects that have been created in recent times. But I just want to really question the fact of, why are we doing these things? Why are we creating these, creating guidelines or creating grids or creating, these kind of set of rules to define the work that may or may not actually survive in the context they actually live? And, doing a little bit of research, I think it really kind of stems from this sort of modernist position. We look at these guideline books of the Vignelli's MTA system or Brockman's Swiss rail system, and you think about this, you see a lot of the same diagrams, the same sort of behaviors applied to these systems. But in this context, they're very much useful in the case that they are literally set up for production, for example. So this example for the Swiss railway logo, the grid construction is really set up for a sign painter to be able to replicate and recreate this logo exactly to spec. It's not about how it was designed, not about why it was designed. It's a formula to give this person to produce the work consistently in the context of where it needs to live. And that goes for every part of these guidelines. They're instruction manuals of production. And I find this quite interesting because these are really fascinating, very detailed guidelines of how to ultimately create the work. And in their time are incredibly useful because, you know, this is before we had Adobe, this is before we had software applications to automate a lot of this stuff for us. So this is the way we dealt with it. This was handed off to fabricators or painters or whoever actually had to generate this work and create it. So it was consistently produced in the context it needed to live. And so we needed these strict manuals, these rule-based manuals to do this. And they're really, really fascinating and really, really interesting pieces of documents. And I find, you know, as we move forward and think about today, that, you know, a lot of these, we see a lot of the same behavior brought into the contemporary guideline to an extreme amount. And I just want to reiterate that these guidelines are set up for consistency of production. So if I'm creating a grid for a logo or a layout, this is set up for a printer or a sign painter or whoever's fabricating things. And so there is like a rule book. It's like a blueprint. And if I think about today, you know, if I look at brand guidelines today, for example, they aren't blueprints. They're these complex, convoluted documents that have tremendous amount of information in them. And the expectation of that document is that's supposed to be executed consistently by the people producing the work after the engagement of, say, the client and the branding company or the design company. And if you think about that, if I look at the things in the 60s and know what we have to do today, whether all this, you know, wide range of stuff that needs to be produced a brand, it's kind of ridiculous when you really think about it. And you see a document that's 200 pages long that has all this different material in there. This is just pulled some, you know, open source guidelines. You know, you see the lockup, social lockups, color variation, scale, clear space, partnerships, placement, rotation, logo animation, application, things to avoid, and so on and so forth. And this goes on for page after page after page after page. And it's funny because it's still just designed in a static document, usually in 16:9 to be viewable on screen. And then you see these things like these safety zones and this kind of like nonsensical geometry about how this is supposed to be produced. I mean, no one's gonna actually like reproduce these things. Then you see these color palettes that are just really, really rich and complex, and this really complex typography. And how it's sort of broken down, and then you see these, you know, usage of how to do it, how not to do it, and it's just, quite frankly, it's just, I think, a little bit crazy. And if you really kind of look at this thing, you know, you see these documents that just goes page after page, and it's just filled with this information. And the expectation of this is that someone else is going to have to learn this, look at these guidelines, and try to reproduce that manually. So ultimately, in quite seriousness, if I'm given a guideline, which I have in many projects, I look at this and I'm like, this is ridiculous. So like, I'm going to look maybe at the typefaces, maybe at the colors, maybe at some of the key art direction assets, and try to like quickly design based on that. But there's no way that, you know, functionally as a production person who's working production is going to go through there line by line and try to figure this out to produce it correctly. And I think this raises a much bigger question in the advent of sort of visual identity and design systems. These things need to be really easy to be produced because it needs to move fast. It needs to get into market quickly. And so any time that there's a time hang up in production, it ultimately is going to cost money for the company to have something that's super complex and convoluted to produce as a brand asset. So I think, you know, and that's something that in our studio, not being critical of this, but just thinking more about this problem and how we can make this much easier moving forward. And I think that it raises much bigger questions about how we actually produce the design itself. So, I mean, first and foremost, the format complexity is we have infinite formats that the work needs to live, whether it's banner ads, screens, websites, social media, you name it, like VR, AR, there's so many different formats this work needs to live, and it has to be there living in a consistent expression. Also, the majority of these formats are going to be enabled with motion and interactive capabilities, whether it's a narrative thing like a TV spot or an experiential piece of motion, like a fashion show or whatever, some screens. And so you have this really highly tech-enabled possibilities of branding that you have possibilities through interactive motion being the central to this. So, why aren't we thinking about this first as we're producing the work? And then ultimately, beyond just having sign painters produce logos, we got to do things that are interactive. We got to have things that are moving. They got to work in all these different formats. So how on earth are we going to produce these visual identities consistently with a sense of ease through the production team? So we have to, thinking about that, it's kind of crazy to think that we can take a 200-page guideline and then expect this to work. So I think the proposition that we considered is, and I'm going to share it in 2 specific projects, is that, if I look at a visual identity, for example, at a very kind of broad outlook of it, you have the core elements, logos, colors, composition, typography, iconography, et cetera, et cetera. That's essentially like a list of rules, a list of rules that automates the output. The aesthetic of the work comes through this rule-based system of the identity and how it executes. So why, if in fact that we have a formula, why can that just be programmed? For real, we can literally just program the visual identity, because we don't need to actually show the rules of how the type works if we can just bake it directly in code and create software or software tools or toolkits that just do that for us. Because just like I said before, someone who's producing the work isn't going to want to have to learn the language of producing this identity quickly. They want to be able to do this efficiently and fast to make sure it's consistently done. So we need to enable that and make it much easier. So the first project I want to talk about is our Squarespace rebrand. We did this back in 2018. And what's interesting about this, it's sort of defining a system through generative flexibility movement. So rather than just like a logo being the central thing for the brand identity, it actually, the movement and behavior of it is the defining component of how everything's created. So very simple, square in space. Using an isometric space to generate the expression of the brand is what ultimately impacts the entire brand identity across the board to maintain its consistency and gives it a kind of improvised flexibility in the possibilities of what it's done. So here's just some examples of the behaviors that come out of this system. So starting to look at this more functionally and what we can do just through motion and square in space. But getting into the tools in this discussion of creating generative tools, to actually produce this this kind of work, we actually generated and created tools to do certain things. So we automated the type layouts, and there's different variations of that. We automated a lot of the type setting, but we allowed for a lot of flexibility in compositions and developing, how the images could be placed or how the layouts could be placed. This gives flexibility in the usage of this, but always guarantees this square and space concept within this. But you're allowing this tool to give you more possibilities much quicker than, say, if I was trying to set up a grid or a logo. So here's just some examples of, part of the suite of tools that were provided with the Squarespace team during the project to allow us to sort of create and iterate on work much quicker than if we were doing this in a traditional sense. And this is just affecting colors, the image containing, and this is a more sort of radical expression with the isometric cube grid sort of building itself out. See how quickly we can kind of adjust and iterate and change compositions. And this would take so much time to do in traditional software. So it makes sense to just have this, freestanding tool that we can just create and play with while we're sort of producing the work. And then again, thinking about even how the flexibility of the templates are. I mean, we need to have, it could be square, 16 by 9, all these different ratios need to be in context. And we also make sure that the text is going to be responsive for that as well. So here's an example of the social media system, so you can see how it works functionally, how it works expressively, through all the different assets. And it's quite interesting. You see this consistency, but this very improvised, expressive quality of the work too, because how it's based on a motion-based system. Here's the brand film. Just going to play this through. And moving forward, and then in the interactive expression too, you can see where this isometric angle starts to come to play within the interaction of the Squarespace website. So you're seeing how this behavior through motion, through a generative way of thinking, gives us possibilities of executing the work in a myriad of ways in all this different expression, which is quite interesting. You can even see here the image containers. And then out of home examples, you can see how this is expressed, and you still get that same energy even with the static format. Here's some examples in Times Square on it coming to life. And each iteration has its new flavor, new sort of feel, but always sort of rooted in that square and space concept, so you have this consistency brought through. Here's another example of that. And then some generative export, so you can see this interplay between the static and motion, and this sort of the generative system that sort of develops this gives this tremendous amount of possibilities to create these pieces of work, and ultimately thinking about the time of production of these assets. These take seconds to produce, and they're not done manually, so you're saving a tremendous amount of effort at the production end of this job to produce these assets, which is a huge bonus, I think, for thinking about a brand system, especially on a corporate level, where things need to move quickly, need to be fast, but also need to be highly effective. And so again, looking at this is a huge reaction to these brand guidelines that require this manual understanding of these rules, where we can actually create systems to generate it for us. Moving to the last project I want to discuss is this Space 10. Space 10 is the research lab, a research lab based in Copenhagen that's ran by IKEA. And this project was really even more interesting in a way of how far we could push this idea of a generative tool or a brand guideline baked within software. So for example, in this case, there is the entire piece of the branding work is all contained in freestanding software that Space 10 uses to export marketing material or brand assets through the software itself. That's all been enabled through motion and interaction. And so this gives you an example. You can change text, you can adjust layouts, we have a tremendous amount of presets to generate different animations. And what's great about this is that I can change formats, 1:1, 16:9, 4:5, 2:1, whatever. And even customize the formats itself. So any time that I have an asset that I need to create, I can change the format, hit export, whether I can export a still and export an animation, export a GIF, and put it in the context that it's going to live. So what's great about this is that you don't even need to be a designer to work with this. You can just select a preset, hit export, post on Instagram, post on social media, or hit export, send it to the media company to put in the out-of-home piece. So this is, I think, this starts to paint a picture of the possibilities of what we can do in the future to start to automate a lot of the tasks that would be fundamentally done by hand traditionally. And I think also something like this, you're really starting to consider how motion and interaction becomes so central to the design process to be able to generate and create something like this. Like I wouldn't be able to create something like this if I was just coming from an angle of a book designer or poster designer. You have to be thinking like almost like a filmmaker, or being in the lens of a camera of something moving and evolving to be able to even spec something out like this. So the design process to get here is fundamentally different than what traditionally has been done. This is interesting because you have all these presets and you can see it's being loaded and you're getting these different effects. So you have this rich expression of the brand just encased within this application where you can adjust typography, input images, videos, and export all the brand assets with this freestanding application that you can just install on your computer. And then you could be a social media manager or the head of brand design. All can use this tool to then activate the work seamlessly across the spectrum of the assets. So here's some examples of the export, again, directly out of the actual software. This wasn't brought through Cinema 4D or After Effects or any existing software. This is just an export directly from the software itself. And you can see these experiences or these pieces of design. These things couldn't even be done in the existing software, or if they would, it would take days to actually produce or create something like this, where this can essentially be done in a matter of seconds. So you can see the efficiency that can come through in something like this. And then also it's very captivating, very sort of intensely rich from the design perspective that we can produce stuff like this, and quite gratifying to see visually as well the potential of this. So here's some more examples of this, so different exports. So you can see this kind of rich graphic system coming through just by the usage of a tool that embeds the rules to create the tool essentially. So which is kind of an interesting interplay of the title of this talk. And then a more traditional approach, you can see just the basic typesetting locked in with some footage from existing campaigns sort of brought together. So this could be an out-of-home ad that you would see in the train station, or could be on TV or whatever. You could so I think what's interesting about the Space 10 and the Squarespace projects is you start to look at brands or design systems through this generative lens, where we can actually create software tools that activate this work rather than just sitting back and looking at these guidelines that are completely ridiculous and aren't really empathetic to the people who are producing the work, where this is very empathetic to people producing the work because it can be done in a matter of seconds to get this kind of rich output. So in conclusion, just to wrap things up, I think the first thing is to produce work like this, you have to consider design through a lens into a moving or interactive world. We're no longer designing fixed format posters or books. We're in a world that's moving and constantly evolving and changing. We have different formats, different sizes, different lengths of time we're dealing with. So we should take advantage of the fact that we have the capability to do such immersive work now. So the way we think about the design needs to be considering that. So the way we look at brand expression now, our social media feed is far more important than the out-of-home poster. So the emphasis of how we design needs to be engaging and captivating at a tiny size of a square in motion than the massive billboard you might see in the city that you're in. So putting emphasis on where the work's going to live, whether it's mainly going to be digital, is going to impact how we ultimately design the work itself. So, thinking about capturing and creating moments rather than constructing grids gridding and constructing the actual composition, you're much more freeing and much more liberating in how we can actually create the work itself. So, and I think, looking forward and, branding and, brand programs or brand guidelines, a successful system is empathetic to those responsible for producing the work. So while, there's been some amazing branding projects done in recent times, but I think, looking at them and being critical of them and taking a position of wow, I have a really complex color palette, really complex typographic guidelines, really complex, all these elements. If they can be complex, if we can automate a lot of these decisions to make it easy to execute on. If it's complex and difficult to learn, say if I have to learn a new language, say if I had to learn Korean in one day, it would be literally impossible to do that. So you can expect, if you have a complex guideline or a complex system set up, if you're not providing tools to make it easier for the people to produce it, it's going to not work. It's going to fall apart. It's not going to be activated consistently. And then also that has big implications on both time and money spent for the actual company that's going to be onboarding this kind of project. If you have a great design system that's hard to produce, then that's going to be a poor investment, I think, for a branding project. So we need to really think about these and consider these things as we begin these projects. And we need to think of alternative ways, just like I presented in the Squarespace project and Space 10 project, that that ease this and allow for new ways of thinking, new ways of creating design, and even more richer experience than we have been doing in the past. So to finish up, program the rules and provide software tools. I want to say thank you to everyone at the Korea Design Herald, and it's been an honor that we were invited to give this lecture. Hopefully this is a thought starter. I'm not necessarily being critical of existing brand guidelines and branding projects, but I want to start to think about things and at least have a question in your mind to challenge some of these behaviors or these existing sort of formulas that have been going on in the past. Do they work in motion? Do they work on screen? Is this way of thinking about the work and activate properly for a branding project? Is this going to be easy to produce? Is it going to be something that's going to be able to evolve and be consistently executed over the long term? So these are big questions, I think, when considering a rebrand or a brand evolution, that there is a big investment in this kind of project from a corporate level, and we need to think about this stuff very, very thoughtfully and to make sure we're making good decisions there. Whether it's a great design piece that wins press when it comes out of the release is one thing, but if it isn't effective in the long term and isn't helpful long term, then is that a successful piece of work? It's a question mark. So hopefully this was helpful and interesting. And again, thank you very much. And hopefully I can see you guys in Korea at some point in the future. All right. Bye-bye.